College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the GSB, the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering, the Department of Geologic and Atmospheric Sciences, the Department of Horticulture, the Department of Natural Resources, Ecology and Management. This will take about an hour. The Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, the Graduate Program on Sustainability, the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, the Institute of Science and Society, the ISU Council on Sustainability, Iowa State University Extension to Families, the F. Wendell Miller Lecture Fund, which comes from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Leopold Center, Ryman Gardens, and it's funded in part through a major grant from Humanities Iowa, which brings me to the little pieces of paper on your seat or next door to you. We would love you to, we actually need you to fill out these audience response forms because they are required by the Humanities Iowa people who have helped fund this. The other announcement is that books of Patricia's award-winning, copies of Patricia's award-winning book are available outside. Are we almost ready?
I thought we were ready.
I'm going to make a formal introduction in a minute.
1 second.
Okay. I'll just sit down and you yell
If
when you're
I'm...
ready. That looks pretty good.
We'll fake it from here.
Here it is.
Thank you. I didn't hear a word of what you said.
Okay, let me...
No.
I have to
All right.
introduce you formally, okay? Patricia Kleindienst left academia because the work wasn't engaging her the way she'd hoped, and she wound up pursuing an inspiration. Her book, The Earth Knows My Name, available in the lobby, won her the American Book Award in 2007. It displays an incredible array of areas of expertise, what we at the university would call disciplines. She ranges over history and politics, anthropology, sociology and psychology, and geography, and of course agriculture and horticulture. But she weaves these together so that you're not even aware of moving from ethnography to geography, from family to food to faith. These various dimensions of human life are integrated in her thinking, and so they come out integrated in her writing. And the writing is truly excellent. The compassion for her subjects is strong, but not at the expense of precision and realism. Patricia is personal, yet universal themes are uncovered in the most individual and contextualized of stories. What I find at the core is how gardens and caring for them enable preservation and adaptation of ethnic groups: Indians and Native Americans, Italians and Japanese, Gullah from Africa, and natives from Cambodia. For all of them, growing crops and preparing food restores identity by celebrating community. So I want to get a sample from her book and read it to you. Here's a sample from her book. Patricia quotes a Cambodian immigrant living and gardening in Massachusetts and then makes her own observation. So this is Sokane. How do you pronounce Sokane? Sokane talking. He's talking about his... He's talking about his the people in his group. The garden is their spiritual place. As soon as they start to see the thing grow, they feel so connected. They can be here all day long. They even ask people if they can build a house here because they don't want to go to town. They don't want to see anyone. They just want to talk to their own garden. And that's how they want to do, these growers. I mean, they're not crazy. This is the thing that's so kind to them. It doesn't speak a foreign language. It speaks their own language. Whatever they touch, it grows right out. And now Patricia comments on this. It is not only words that have the power to bind and connect, to shape the anarchic flow of human experience into a continuous narrative that begins to heal what has been torn apart by violence. There is also the silent and mysterious transaction of a hand burying a seed in the darkness of the earth. Please join me in welcoming Patricia to our fair city.
can actually turn out the lights. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience. I'm so sorry about the technological snafu. And now we have to deal with the lights. I've had a wonderful time. Can you hear me back there? Yeah. Okay. If my voice becomes faint, would someone in the back wave at me and let me know so I make sure you can hear me? I want to thank everyone who's brought me here tonight, and I've met the most wonderful people here at the university in the last couple of days. I met some wonderful people at the public library for a writing workshop, met with a wonderful class this morning, had lunch with some undergraduates and a graduate student, a faculty seminar, and now here this evening after dinner with some more great people. I'm very happy to bring this work to Iowa because I owe an apology to the Midwest. It's the one region of the country I didn't get to write about for this book, so I hope you'll forgive me. So I want to begin by showing you two gardens that in some ways sum up my whole project. Can you lower the lights or no? Okay. This is Middleton Place Plantation. Some of you may know it, some of you may not. It's on the Ashley River just outside of Charleston. Have any of you ever been there?
I lived there.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, this garden is considered one of the greatest gardens in the world. It's the first landscape garden in America, and it became Henry Middleton's when he married into the Middleton family. It's extraordinary for its rise up above the Ashley River. This is part of the Low Country, which is named obviously because it's so flat. And its most salient characteristics that you can see up here, this very formal garden divided into rooms, which was modeled after Le Nôtre's Versailles. One of the things that intrigued me when I began to talk to immigrants and Native Americans and African Americans, immigrants about their gardens, was that whenever I read about gardens in America, there was virtually no politics or history to it. It was always about the surface beauty of a garden. And if you look at this, that's what they're trying to do too. There are no human beings here in this picture. It's the landscape itself which is supposed to compel attention and draw your gaze to the surface. No one would say that Le Nôtre's Versailles is not political. No one would deny that it's rich in history. Why is it that when we look at gardens in the United States, we don't think in those terms? That's a question I'll just leave open for you. I also want to say that after I've finished the talk, I hope that you'll ask questions and tell your own stories, because I think many of you probably are gardeners or farmers and have a family heritage on the land. The other most famous characteristic of this garden are these beautiful steps carved out of the landscape. They're to imitate the great steps of an aristocratic house in Europe, and they come down to this pair of man-made lakes known as the butterfly lakes because they're supposed to mimic the look of a butterfly wings open. This is all the Ashley River around it that's been dammed up. And when I visited this garden, I took a walk all the way down to this little edge of the butterfly lake. And I read a little pamphlet about the garden, and I made this discovery that the most important characteristic of this garden for me is that it took 100 slaves 10 years to create this garden. And when you are asked to look at just the surface beauty of this garden, you're asked to ignore the question of how it was made, by whom, under what brutal conditions, and for what purpose. So, the people who created this garden were doing this in between planting, harvesting, and processing rice, planting, harvesting, and processing indigo. This was backbreaking labor, and they had no more than hoes and baskets to transport enough mud to build the pyramids of Egypt. The men who built these earthen dikes to hold back the Ashley River were working in water that had water moccasins and alligators in it, and the air around them was sometimes 10 degrees hotter than human blood. So those are the conditions under which this supposedly very beautiful garden was made. I want to contrast this garden and the conditions under which it was made with this one. Some of you may recognize what kind of a garden this is right away. It's a Japanese garden. Yes, that's familiar to some of you. This garden, you can see the moon in the sky. This garden was created at a place called Manzanar. Have any of you ever heard of Manzanar? Yes, Manzanar was the first of the 10 so-called relocation centers that the United States government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt removed 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent to in spring of 1942 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was named for the Spanish word for peach orchard, which is what this used to be. This is the Owens River Valley, And if any of you have ever seen Chinatown, that great Roman Polanski movie with Jack Nicholson, any of you know that? It's the story of when this valley was drained of its water to feed the water to the city of Los Angeles. This photograph was actually taken by Ansel Adams, one of the great, great landscape photographers of America. He took it at dawn when the moon was still hanging in the sky and the air is so still that the water is glassy smooth. So think about what I just told you about the first garden, and then think about this garden. This garden was created by Issei gardeners, that is, first-generation Japanese immigrants, who were taken at gunpoint into Yosemite, one of America's sacred landscapes, where they harvested rocks and fallen trees to shape what is a traditional Japanese stroll garden. And if you look at this garden, you can see that there are no straight lines in it. It's all about curves, and it's to imitate a natural landscape. There's a rock that looks like a turtle swimming upstream. They've created these arched bridges, the uneven stones that lead you to this little covered area for the shade. They've planted all the trees and the flowers. Many of the Japanese who were rounded up, Japanese Americans, were experienced agriculturalists and expert horticulturalists. When they came to this place, which was a desert, the temperature ranged from about 110 degrees in summer to about 10 to 20 below in winter. When they arrived, the shacks that they were forced to build in weren't finished. They were required to finish building the tar paper shacks themselves, wooden and tar paper. They were also required to grow their own food so that they didn't enrage Americans who were incensed by the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so they were required to grow food in what had become a desert. But they were such skilled agriculturalists that in the first season, between March and the harvest in September, they were able to produce enough food to feed all 10,000 prisoners in this camp and ship 80 tons of surplus to the other 9 internment centers. After they did that, they asked for permission to create this garden. And what is this garden meant to produce? I asked myself that question when I looked at it, because one of the gardeners you're going to meet tonight was interned at Manzanar with his entire family. This is a garden that produces nothing but a state of mind. It's meant to affirm the essential human dignity of these prisoners. If you think about it, they can't go back to Japan. America's at war with Japan. Most of them did not want to go back to Japan. America's rejected them. Where is the one place they can be that affirms their sense of who they are as a people, allows them to own their ethnic heritage while also having a place on American land? A garden. And that's the idea of the garden that I want to talk to you about tonight. The power of this garden to transform a prison camp into a place where they can find peace and dignity and meaning in spite of everything going on around them. It's the idea of a garden as a sanctuary, as a place that affirms a kind of transcendent value. We normally don't think of gardens that way, but that's the idea that came to me as I wrote this book. Ansel Adams came to this camp. He was too old to fight in the war, so he wanted to be of use, and so that the head of this camp, a man named Merritt, said, "You could help by documenting life in this camp." So Ansel Adams produced his first work of social documentary. It was called Born Free and Equal, and it was to persuade Americans to think of these immigrants as other Americans like themselves. America has a history in times of political crisis, like following 9/11 or the Red Scare or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, of turning on its immigrants. It's something that we do periodically, and Ansel Adams wanted to produce a work to remind us of our greatness as a nation, to stop this kind of rejection of our immigrant heritage. He published the book, which became an instant bestseller on the West Coast, and the Museum of Modern Art had a special show. And then within a week, people began to hold public book burnings of his book. And the book disappeared from every bookshelf of every bookstore in the entire United States, and Ansel Adams never knew what happened to it. As a result, he donated all of the negatives from this collection to the Library of Congress, and any of you can do research and use these for free. So this is the overarching set of concerns, a kind of ethical question about America, American history, the place of immigrants, and the role of gardens in their heritage and ours. This is where my book begins. This is Tesuque Pueblo on the Rio Grande in New Mexico. This is the actual center of the Pueblo, Catholic Church in the corner, and this is the smallest and one of the most conservative of the Pueblos. And this is one of the most ancient of the crops domesticated by Native Americans thousands of years ago. Of course, it's a squash blossom. And this is Clayton Bracupe. He's a Mohawk Indian who married a Tiwa woman from the Pueblo. When I took this photograph and interviewed him for my book, he was the head of the Traditional Native American Farming Association. And I wanted my book to begin with the most sacred and the oldest garden tradition of the Americas, which is the Native American garden. And of course, the most sacred crop of all is corn. And here is Clayton standing. Behind him is a field of Hopi blue corn. In front of him is tobacco, which is grown for ceremonial use only. And those are the great mountains in the background. The corn that he's growing, you'll see, is not as tall as some of the corn that grows here in Iowa. When corn traveled north from Oaxaca into what is now the United States, the Indians who carried it with them decided where they would disperse to, and as they dispersed, the corn adapted to the different climatic conditions, the soil conditions, and the way they grew the corn. So it evolved into what we call local land races. And so if you look at corn, you are used to fields and fields of yellow corn or sweet corn, but Native American corn actually comes in every color of the rainbow. I met a Cherokee elder while I was writing this book who has a living seed bank in Oklahoma in which he has 2,000 varieties of sacred heirloom Native American corn. He grows them out, keeps them pure, and gives them back to the tribes of North and South America. So this Hopi blue corn co-evolved in the Southwest. The reason this is important, there are several reasons. Corn is considered the mother of the people to Native Americans in this tribe. When Native Americans came into a cash economy, the wage economy, they were self-sufficient on the land well into the 1960s in New Mexico. And then when they joined the wage economy, they began to eat a mainstream American diet. Their ancestors had co-evolved with the plants that they domesticated to such an extent that when Native Americans stopped eating those traditional plants and began eating a white man's diet, they developed an epidemic of adult-onset diabetes. So literally, to eat the food we eat makes them sick. To stop growing the food in traditional ways makes the land sick. And so you have this argument, some of you may have heard, about the whole connection between people, place, food, seeds, ecology. And the most elegant example of this is Native Americans. So in an effort to heal their communities, they've gone back to growing out heirloom crops, eating their traditional foods, cooking them traditional way, and they've made the discovery that they can not only arrest the diabetes, but reverse it. At the same time, by practicing their traditional agriculture, they're restoring their land to life. So this is a little example. They look like little Swedish meatballs or meteorites that have landed. These are seed balls. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of them or used them. It's a very old Native American tradition that actually came back to them through a Japanese farmer named Masanobu Fukuoka. They would take the children down to the Tsuki River, and they have the seed of the native grasses to the southwest, and the children gather the warm, wet river mud, and they roll the seed into these balls. And then they spread them out on tarps to dry. And then they have a ritual. They take all the children from the Pueblo out into the fields, and they toss them up and disperse them over the fields. When the monsoon rains come, the birds don't eat the seed, right? The monsoon rains gradually melt these seed balls, so it gives the seeds a chance to sprout. It also mimics the natural dispersion of nature. Now, why are they doing this? They're reseeding the grasses. Any of you have been to New Mexico? That beautiful, beautiful landscape. It's actually an ecological disaster, that wide open, reddish-brown landscape. And it was caused by the introduction of grazing animals when the Spaniards, the conquistadors, came. The conquistadors record in their chronicles that their horses were belly deep in grass when they came into New Mexico. So that's what this effort is about. This is a Native American farm on Tsuki Pueblo. Corn, fields and fields of corn, beans, squash, tobacco. And one of the things I want you to notice is that the entire Pueblo is out here farming and gardening, and there are no fences. Everybody knows exactly whose land is whose. Nobody trespasses on each other's land. On these Pueblos, there's no such thing as private property. The land is communally owned. And these are Clayton's daughters helping to harvest the corn. So you have this movement then for Native American tribes to reclaim their heritage, to heal themselves and heal the land. Their neighbors are people like this, David Fresquez and his wife Loretta, who are descendants of the settlers that followed the conquistadors. This family, some of you may relate to this. One of the things that's impressed me in the last 2 days is how many people I meet whose roots go so deep into Iowa soil. You've lived here for generations. This is your home. You feel connected here. Many Americans are rootless, but that doesn't seem to be what I'm hearing here in Iowa. David Frescas and his wife, Loretta, have never lived more than 5 miles from where their first ancestors settled in 1625 in the Espanola Valley of New Mexico. They used to work at Los Alamos, and then when David got laid off, he started a garden. He started growing tomatoes. What's interesting about this is they have in common with the Indians, the former conquered people and the former conquistadors have in common the fact that both of them were pulled away from their tradition of sustainability on the land. This family had always eaten off the land until the latest generation that entered the wage economy. They had also always spoken Spanish. They speak a very rare form of Spanish that's not spoken anywhere else in the world because of their isolation up there in the Rio Grande Valley. So, in fact, it turned out to be a good thing when the wage economy sort of forced them out, and it forced them back onto the land where they reclaimed their heritage. These images are taken at the Santa Fe Farmers Market, which is one of the most resplendently beautiful farmers markets in America. And so David and Loretta have gone back to growing all of the crops they grew up with. Their grandmothers used to make blue corn tortillas. And when I heard this, I began to realize one of the facts of history that these gardens give back to me that I'm sharing with you. The corn passed from the conquered people, the Indians, to the conquerors, the Spanish. The corn, as I told you, is so sacred to Native Americans that it's considered the mother of the people. In this tradition, in the Spanish tradition of this valley, Loretta told me that on the 4 holiest days of the year, they eat a food that they only eat those 4 days, and it's made from blue corn. It's called panocha, and it's sprouted blue corn pudding. And wherever her children are, she mails it to them for the holy days, from Holy Thursday to Easter Sunday. And so one of the things I discovered in traveling the country and talking to immigrants and ethnic people about their gardens is this whole way in which seeds and food are part of a very ancient religious tradition that they keep alive and pass on. This is their pumpkin harvest. They have 1 acre of land, 1 acre in their backyard. They grow 20 tons of food a season on 1 acre of land. And they do it all organically and sustainably. So that's some of the oldest part of America. I come from New England. And in New England, and maybe you're taught this too, we're always taught that the history of America begins with the Puritans coming, Thanksgiving, the funny hats, the Indians giving them corn, all of that stuff. Turkeys were, of course, one of the great foods that the Europeans discovered when they came here. What we're not usually taught is that actually the first conquest of America was in the Southwest. So that's why my book doesn't start with the Puritans, it ends with them. It begins with the conquistadors in the Southwest. So then I thought to myself, originally I was going to write a book just about immigrants and see the garden as this process of adaptation and transition and cultural, really they're culture bearers, passing their culture on. And then when I realized, no, there are other ethnic people who suffer the same difficulties, the same pressure to assimilate, become American, become American. One of the questions I have for you is, what does that mean? So I thought, okay, I have to do African Americans. So I wanted to find African Americans whose roots are still very close to Africa, and that's the Gullah people of the Sea Islands that stretch from South Carolina all the way down to Florida. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of them. Gullah is the name of the people as well as the language. And it derives from Africa. No one knows quite whether it's a reference to a place like Angola or whether it's a reference to some word in one of the languages. When the English started the Atlantic slave trade, when they would round up these different African ethnic groups and put them in pens waiting to get on the ships to be shipped in the triangular trade, many of whom came into Rhode Island and South Carolina, all these different ethnic groups would have to communicate with each other. And so the African captives began to meld a language together out of all of their different dialects. And the substrate of it was the King's English, and that's Gullah. If you've ever heard of Brer Rabbit, the Brer Rabbit stories, that's Gullah. This is Otis Days. He is the 6th generation on this land. He's never lived anywhere else in his entire life. He can tell you every person who's lived on this land. This 10-acre plot came down to his family through Jane Smalls, who was the first ancestor freed from slavery in 1862. How many of you have been on the land for 6 generations? Anybody? No, it's kind of amazing. And this is probably the only place in America where you will find African Americans who are still on the same land. This is the other Gullah elder I met down in St. Helena. This is Ralph Middleton. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what they had to say about the land. I talked to you about the Native Americans' love of their corn and the religious meaning that the corn has both for the Hispanics and the Native Americans. Otis is growing all the foods that his ancestors would have grown in what was known as their provision gardens. Under slavery, the white planters understood very early that it was to their best advantage to let the slaves have gardens. And if you read the diaries of the white planters from the South, what you'll hear them saying is, these Africans love their gardens and their animals so much that if you let them have them, they're less likely to run away. So part of the testimony about the Africans actually bringing their tradition of loving the soil over with them actually comes from the white planters. So when Otis took me through his fields and showed me what he was growing all these foods that his family has eaten for all these generations. And his garden reaches not just back 6 generations, it reaches all the way back to Africa. The cuisine of the South is actually a melding of 3 cultures: African culture, European culture, English culture, and Native American culture, particularly Cherokee. And so he grows okra. Okra is an African name for an African crop. And one of the things I learned is that no one knows how the seeds of the original African American garden came here. We really don't know. Somehow or other, they got here. So Otis's garden reflects this ancient history of his people. And he said to me when I was talking to him about his land, he said, I love my land. I love just where I'm at, and I know my neighbors love it too. He said, you got to love your land. You got to love your land the way you love your husband or your wife. You got to love it. And I was so moved by that language. And I came to understand that what I was hearing was a cultural heritage of an intimate bond to the land itself, this sense of reverence for the land, that the land is where the bones of your ancestors are. It's the seeds you plant, it's the food you eat, and it literally grounds you in life. So when I talked to Ralph Middleton, who's in his 80s, who actually has lived elsewhere but came back to St. Helena to retire, he was growing a different kind of a garden. He has reintroduced indigo to this island for the first time in 200 years. You all have known about cotton. If you've seen Gone with the Wind, you know all about cotton, right, in the plantations. Most of us don't remember that indigo played a huge role in the plantation system of the South. This is what an indigo plant looks like. And this is from a French encyclopedia. This is the actual processing of indigo on a plantation in the South. The most important thing I learned about the plantation system, which I want to share with you, is that the way I come to understand it is that it stands for America's first catastrophic experiment with industrial agriculture. It stands for our first attempt at monocropping, creating cash crops that were traded in a global marketplace. This is not new. Every single one of these plants failed because it was monocropped, and it failed because first it stripped the land of nutrients, polluted the water. Also, monocropping made these plants extremely vulnerable to pests and crop failure. So rice failed, indigo failed, ultimately cotton failed, because they were against the norms of nature. Also, they re-engineered the land so that tons and tons of topsoil washed down the rivers and flowed down and then choked the deltas and changed the entire waterways and landscape of the South. This is Ralph showing you his indigo seeds. So when indigo came to America, it came to America from the French slave colonies in the Indies, and it was begun to grow in the 1740s. It was actually indigo money that built that first gorgeous garden I showed you. That was not built on money from rice. That was built on money raised by indigo. And these seeds that he's showing you are now used by African American school children to create indigo in a traditional African way. So what is the point of this indigo garden? When Ralph discovered that his ancestors had been involved in the growing and processing of indigo on the land where he lives, because he has also been on that land for 6 generations, he said, I want to grow it, I want to reintroduce it. But he's not reintroducing indigo the way that they were forced to grow it under slavery. They're going all the way back to Africa. Indigo is grown in West Africa in a tradition that reaches back at least 5,000 years. And also cotton goes back 5,000 years. And this is a piece of indigo cloth produced from indigo from Ralph's garden by a traditional Nigerian indigo artist who now lives on the island. His name is Adesola. Isn't that a gorgeous blue? We think of indigo in terms of Levi's, blue jeans. But in fact, it was used to create the robes of African princes. And all of the crops that were taken from Africa to America for the plantation system, and all of the technology that was taken from Africa to America, and all of the knowledge and skill of how to grow these crops, we now know was taken from Africa to America. All of these were perverted when they got here. They all were part of local traditions, small villages, self-sufficient villages eating off the land. They were all tied into deeply religious practices. When they were transported to America, they became part of this system of massive injustice and global trade. So this too echoes some of our current situation, which I didn't know until I started writing this book. So there's a way in which that indigo garden heals for Ralph the sense of a tradition torn apart by the slave trade. He can reconnect it and reclaim some of his heritage in Africa. The reason that's important, it's something that all of these gardeners had in common, but let me make one last little point about the Gullah. One of the things that we were all taught about the slave trade, or certainly I was taught and these people were taught for generations, is that, first of all, white prejudice taught us that Africans had no culture. They were primitive people. We know that isn't true now. But we were also taught that the extreme conditions of the slave trade had wiped out whatever culture they had. We now know that that isn't true. The Gullah language is so intact, and it is still so alive, that when the president of Sierra Leone came to St. Helena Island, he spoke his native dialect, which is called Krio, K-R-I-O, and the Gullah people understood him. All their lives, they had been taught that their language was a bastard form of English. It was the ignorant language of slaves. In that moment, they understood that, in fact, it was a living African language. And if they now make trips back to Sierra Leone and they're greeted there like lost kin, and when they go there, they see a landscape that looks exactly like their landscape, and they see rice eaters just like they are. And their baskets in South Carolina are so close to the African baskets that a friend of mine took one to the Smithsonian Institute and said to an expert in African baskets, "Where do you think this basket is from?" And he said, "Oh, no question. Without a doubt, this basket was woven in Sierra Leone." And my friend said, "No, it's made on St. Helena Island in South Carolina." So think of that. 250 years of separation, genocide, slavery, diaspora, their language, their cuisine, their seeds, and their baskets are all intimately still tied to Africa. It's an astonishing story of the survival of culture. And that all came back through learning about these gardens. So now I'm going to start some of the immigrant stories. And since I got a late start, I'm going to move a little quickly. I hope not too quickly. This goes back to that second garden I showed you, the Japanese garden. This is from the Bainbridge Island website, and it was Executive Order 9066 that FDR signed that transported all of the Japanese Americans from the West Coast to these camps. This is the image of Bainbridge Island. The man you're about to meet, Akio Tsuyamatsu, a Japanese berry farmer, his family had to walk this ramp down to the ferry. They were given a day. They were to send one responsible male adult to go down to register the family, and then military trucks went from farm to farm to farm on the island, picked the families up. They were allowed to take only what they can carry, and you can see these are the whole families going down the ramp to get on the ferry. They had no idea where they were being taken. And this is Akio in the 60s. When Akio was taken with his family, he was a young man. He was the oldest of 9 children. His parents didn't speak English. They were berry farmers, and this beautiful farm you see behind him is Day Road Farm. It's the oldest, largest working farm on Bainbridge Island. And this island was created by these Issei, these Japanese immigrants. And the way they did it is the Japanese were only allowed to get the worst land, the land that had been lumbered off. It was stumps and rocks and ruined land, but they were such sophisticated agriculturalists that they would take the stumps out bring the land back to life, and they became berry growers. They were the most famous producers of berries in the Pacific Northwest. If any of you have seen or read Snow Falling on Cedars, that's the story of this island. And the Japanese man in that story, his story is based partly on Akio. So when Akio was taken to Manzanar with his family, most of his family didn't want to come back. When the Japanese were interned, the government did nothing to protect their land, their businesses, their homes, or their savings. So most of them lost everything. And most of the Japanese lost their farms, and many of them didn't return. But this family was particularly lucky because the white man who owned the electric company bought their farm, took over the mortgage. And at the end of the war, when the family was released, Akio and his father came back, and the man gave them back their farm and charged no interest whatsoever. And this made such a profound impression on him that when he met his friend Gerard Bentrin, who planted this vineyard, and Gerard came to him needing land. This is Gerard Bentrin, who's a Polish-American. Akio said, "You can have this land and share this land with me as long as you want. If you ever have trouble paying the mortgage because of hard times in the economy or the weather, that's okay. But if you ever have hard times simply because you're sloppy, that's not okay." But his ethic is, I will pass on to you the generosity that somebody else passed on to my family. So these two men consider themselves brothers, and they share this farm, half of which, you can see it, half of which is this beautiful vineyard on one side, and these are Akio's pumpkins, that's Akio's compost. It's this marvelous melding of these two ethnic people who feel marginalized by general culture, but who have this passionate love of beauty and passionate devotion to this piece of land. What's happening to this farm, I'm not sure. There are different things we could talk about what's endangering land in Iowa, but what's endangering land up here, this island is right across from Seattle in Puget Sound. Microsoft has its headquarters in Seattle, and it's created what we call Microsoft millionaires, this whole generation of young millionaires. And what do they want to do? They want to live on this island because it's beautiful and there's a great ferry. So they start buying up farmland and developing it. So they begin to build these McMansions, and the property taxes go up. Now the farmers can't afford the taxes. So the farmers are land rich and cash poor. The farmers can't compete for medical care. They can't compete for buying food. They can't compete with anybody on the island because the property taxes are skewed in such a way that farmland is more valuable if it's sold than if it's kept to grow food. So over the period that I met them, isn't this beautiful? These are Gerard's Pinot Noir grapes. Over the period I met them, they were struggling and struggling and struggling to find a way to save the farm. And they finally did. Now, Akio is a recluse. He doesn't want to be anywhere but on his farm because he still has the scar of what it was like to be rounded up and put in the camp. So when I went back to the island after the book came out to do a reading to honor him, he didn't want anything to do with it. So Gerard actually tricked him into posing for this photograph for the local newspaper. And I love this photograph because Akio told Gerard, "Look, I want to die on my tractor. I want to die on my land. If you ever find me keeled over on my tractor or on my land, promise me you won't call the doctor. You will not call an ambulance. Don't let me be taken to a hospital. I was born here. I lived here. I want to die here." And I also love this picture of Akio because Gerard said to him, that earlier picture of him with the berry tray, he's become the poster boy for Bainbridge Island Japanese. So Gerard says, 60 years ago, Akio, they hated you because you were Japanese and they didn't know you. Now they love you because you're Japanese and they still don't know you. Okay, where are we? Just guess. Where do you think you are here? Vietnam. You're 5 minutes from Emily Dickinson's house in Amherst, Massachusetts. And that is indeed a Vietnamese farmer's hat, but it's a Cambodian refugee from the Pol Pot genocide wearing it. She's watering white rimé, which covers a crop known as watergrass. In Cambodia, it would be grown in water, but in America, it's an invasive species if you grow it in water, so they had to learn how to grow it in land. And this is part of what I call the genius for adaptation that all of these gardeners taught me. This is Prakom. This is her sister, Praki. How do you like the LA Raiders sweatshirt and the nylon sweatpants? This is a little blue plastic kiddie pool, And that's a blue plastic tarp behind her, but all these crops you see, that's organically grown water grass, grown from seed. And this is how they work. These women, the ones in the background they've wrapped their scarves into what's called a kroma. That's a traditional Cambodian head wrap. I have to tell you that this day that I visited this garden, it was 96 degrees and 90% humidity. And I was in a little t-shirt and shorts and spraying myself with bug spray, and these women are swathed from head to toe. They work barefoot. They sharpen their knives on rocks. They are expert farmers. They grew up as traditional rice growers in Cambodia, and then when Pol Pot came to power, removed all of the peasantry from the land, forced them to grow rice in a truly irrational manner. It would be as if you took all the people in Iowa and said, you're going to grow corn, but you're going to grow it my way. And it's going to be the wrong way, but if you complain, I'll shoot you. And if you're hungry, working in the hot sun 12 hours a day, growing corn in a way that you know is stupid, you're going to be really hungry, and if you eat any of the corn you're growing, I'm going to shoot you. And by the way, the women will be segregated from the men and the girls from the boys, and you will not call each other by names. No one can use the word father or mother or sister or brother. So Pol Pot tried to break down this traditional agrarian population for 10 years. He removed the people from the city of Phnom Penh. It was the largest mass exodus from an urban center in modern history. These 5 sisters were separated from each other for 10 years. They were tortured, they were slaves, and they suffered from starvation. One of them got out. When she got to America, she was in a UN border camp. She was sponsored by a church. She ends up in Amherst. She gets there. She's cleaning toilets and making beds in a hotel to save the money to hire a detective to go back to the UN border camps and find her sisters. And one by one, she sponsors them and brings them over. And they get here, and they have scarred knuckles and hands where they were chained to posts. They have racing hearts. They have headaches. They have diabetes. They have all of post-traumatic stress disease. They're in their 50s. Imagine if you'd been subjected to that. Could you learn a new language? Could you adapt to a new culture? So they go to see a doctor, and the young doctor says, take up jogging, you'll feel better. Let me give you some Prozac, it'll help with the nightmares. So the sisters look at the doctor after a minute and they say, we farmers, we no run. So a social worker made a deal with the town of Amherst to let them rent 4 acres of arable land, conservation land, and they planted a garden. This is Procom harvesting watergrass. I thought I had a bigger image of the garden here. They planted 4 acres of a garden. They grow 55 varieties of rare Asian fruits, vegetables, and herbs. And they sell them all to the local grocery stores, and at a farmer's market, they take the rest to the farmer's market in Lowell, which is one of the largest Asian communities in New England, and they grow enough to feed all 150 Khmer in Amherst. They also raised enough money to build themselves a Buddhist temple. And one of the great, great honors in Buddhist culture is to be able to feed the monks, because monks only eat twice a day, and monks beg for food. They stand in line outside the temple, holding out their baskets. And one of the great healing functions of this garden is not only to give these women who feel depressed, they feel useless, they come to America, they know nothing. They can't learn the language, they can't get a job, they don't want to be poor, they don't want to be left behind by culture. In Cambodia, they were strong, they were respected, they were farmers, they were the heads of their families. Once they had the garden, it restored their sense of purpose. It gave them a sense of dignity. They stopped being so depressed. So then, the last thing they can do is they can take this food and they can bring it to the monks. So the other function of this garden is to restore the link between agriculture, religion, and the people. And one of the greatest things that happened to me is I got invited to Cambodian New Year's in their temple, and I actually watched the feast that these people lay before their Buddhist monks. Because one of the things that happened under Pol Pot is the slaughter of the Buddhist monks and nuns. This is Sokane, my translator. He's the one whose words you read earlier. Spent half of his life in Cambodia, half in America. And he's the one who led me through the gardens and translated between the elders and me. And this is his cousin, Mao Den. She, like him, had to run through these paths through the jungle between Cambodia and Vietnam. For every 100 Cambodians who tried to flee through the jungle to get to the safety of the border camps, 9 survived. And she told me the story of how her mother in the LA Raiders sweatshirt got their entire family out alive. It's just unheard of. She told me story after story of her mother's incredible courage. This is the first generation born in America. This is Davi, and that bouquet is a bouquet of watergrass. And I asked Davi to take me through the garden. I asked her mother permission to walk alone with her through the garden, see those beautiful small crops growing. I said, Davi, show me your favorite part of the garden, which was corn. And she's walking along those pipes, those irrigation pipes, barefoot, balancing as a child would in a farm. And I said, Davi, have you ever been back to your village in Cambodia? She said, oh, no. I don't want to go back there. They have snakes there, and I'm afraid of snakes. And so I was just walking and thinking, and I said, just listening. And then she said, no, actually, that's not true. She said, have you ever seen the film The Killing Fields? Have any of you ever seen it? Very famous film about Cambodia. She said, well, I tried to watch it once, and I couldn't. It was too upsetting. She said, you know that part where the man is so hungry that he cuts the animal's hide and sucks its blood? She said, I wondered if my family was ever that hungry that they had to do that. She's 12. There aren't that many 12-year-olds in America who have to ask themselves that question. So she said, I needed to know what it was really like for my family, so I made myself watch it all the way through. So one of the last days I visited the family, I said, Davi, what do you think when you come here after school to help your grandmother and your aunts in the garden? She said, I think they are very strong and brave. I think they are very smart and they work very hard. She said, I am very proud of them. So now I'm coming to sort of mainstream immigrant gardens that may be more familiar to you. Davi's experience in America is both like and unlike the experience of many firstborn generation immigrants. The difference being, of course, the extremity of her family's situation before they got here. This is Mosca Pellegrini in her garden in San Francisco in the 40s. Any of you who know San Francisco, when was the last time you saw that hill bare of houses? What's interesting about this garden to me, this is Mosca when I met her, when she was 86, in the year about 2002, 2003. She was still gardening the same way. That garden that I just showed you was a World War II garden. Some of us may remember the Victory Garden movement, but for immigrants, it was not something you only did in a crisis. It's not something you only did during the war. After the war was over and everything was okay again, a lot of Americans stopped gardening. These people never stopped gardening. When I met Mosca, she'd been having an organic garden in the United States for about 70 years. This is her husband, Mario, who's 92 when I met him. He's still grafting trees. He was grafting apple trees. He was climbing ladders. They have 5 kinds of figs. When they retired to move to a little suburban house in Redwood City to live near their children and grandchildren, they bought the house. It had an orange tree in the front, and then they went out into the back, and they couldn't even get a pitchfork into the soil because lawn chemicals had killed it. The soil was hard pan. It was dead. And so, using the skill they learned in their native villages in Italy, they brought that dead soil back to life. And I began to hear this story again and again, and I thought, this is one of the things we're never taught about the contribution immigrants make when they come to America. They bring this traditional knowledge of what soil is, and they know how to heal the land. So part of what they're doing when they create their garden is not only healing the split, the pain of being uprooted from their native culture, but they also come to heal the soil. That's the backyard that was dead when they got there. Mario made every stepping stone. They made their tools by hand. They saved all their seeds for generations. They canned everything they didn't eat in a season so that they could eat year-round. And that sink Mosca's washing at, there's a gray water system. All the water they use to clean their vegetables goes right back in the garden. And this I consider just a magnificent example of an immigrant's garden. It's a classic Italian garden, but also what happens is that after a while, living in these cultures in the Bay Area, there's a lot of Asian immigrants. I said to Mosca at one point, what would you say, is this basically an Italian garden? She said, oh no, it's at least as Asian as Italian now. After all these years, she's trading seeds madly with, Japanese, Chinese, people from all over the world, which is the other thing that's happening, the spread and the diversification of culture. So at one point she's saying to me, we eat this, we eat that, because I'd ask each person, what do you eat the most? What's the most important food in your garden? What are the rituals? And she said to me, we eat radicchio every day. You know radicchio. It's that funny little red ball that you cut up and you put in your salad. So we're walking down the garden and she said, Patricia, here is my radicchio. And I said, Masca, where's the red part? She said, Patricia, we are green radicchio people. And I love that because it taught me about this sense of the specificity of a local culture. She's from the Veneto. Venice is the capital of the Veneto. But her family was too poor to ever go to Venice. They lived on a farm. Radicchio grows wild in that part of Italy. It's become a very shishi crop in America, in salads. Most of us have never had green radicchio. They ate it every single day. This is known as sugar of Trieste, and she would get the seeds and bring them over from Italy and grow them in her garden. It's like a part of her kinship system to grow this radicchio. Sometimes when we think about immigrants coming here, because when they arrive here they have no money, they leave their countries for many reasons. Political persecution, war, hunger, whatever, all these different things. A lot of the people I talked to left because of war. This is the doorway to the house of an Italian immigrant from the mountains east of Rome. This is magnificent architecture. It's Roman architecture. It's ancient architecture. And this is the village. They were shepherds. Every blanket, every pair of socks, every sweater, every pair of trousers they had, they made by hand from their sheep. And they lived off the land in magnificent isolation in this mountain range. And this is Tullio Inglesi, who grew up as a shepherd boy in that village and came to America when he was 9. He's now an eco-architect. And it wasn't until he gave me that picture of the archway to his door that I began to understand what had made this man an architect. He'd grown up poor in one sense. He'd never seen money. They had no electricity. They had no running water. They had no toilets. And yet they lived this cultural wealth. They had beauty. They had silence. They had their community. And so he's become an eco-architect in Leverett, Massachusetts. This is his tomatoes. This is part of his garden. He bought a piece of land. He's a man who recycles buildings. This is the first new dwelling he's ever built in all of the years he's been in America, which is about 60 years. He terraced his land, and then he harvested all the rocks and created this pool. These are rain chains in the foreground. All the rainwater is harvested from the roof, goes into the pond, goes into the garden. Again, there's this whole sense in this ethnic gardening tradition of sustainability. One of the things every single one of these people said to me is, Patricia, you waste nothing. You don't waste water, you don't waste soil, you don't waste seeds, you don't waste food, and you don't waste work. This is the beginnings of his garden just after he finished the house, planting the trees. That's where the greenhouse will be. It's entirely edible landscaping. I'm almost finished. This is a pomegranate that Ruhan came, a Punjabi Sikh, harvested from the tree in her backyard the day I came to visit. Tullio gave me tomatoes, and Tullio also took me up on the roof to look down over that beautiful landscape. Every single one of these people introduced me to some aspect of their culture, and Ruhan introduced me to her magnificent garden. She was very much like Masca and Mario Pellegrini. When they arrived in Fullerton, which is a little suburb of Los Angeles, their soil was dead too. This is her husband, Atma. I guarantee that you will not see his picture in an American book about gardens. That tree he's standing next to is a falsa. Have any of you ever heard of a falsa tree? It's an ancient healing fruit. It's a drupe, looks like an olive. The falsa is so ancient that its name is written in Sanskrit in ancient Ayurvedic healing texts in India. And together, Ruhan and Atma have created on a postage stamp of land. It's about a third the size of this room. They grow 55 varieties of Asian fruits and vegetables and herbs and spices. She keeps bees. She grows sugar cane. She grows neem trees from seeds. I don't know if you've ever heard of neem trees. This is her backyard. Imagine, again, this soil was dead, completely killed by lawn chemicals when she got there. And I said, okay, Ruhan, how'd you bring it back to life? she started planting little tiny trees, little tiny baby trees, and the roots would go deep into the earth and aerate the soil. You all know this, right? You know this about how soil works. And then she gradually built it up. So she went around, and her model of what she was doing in her garden was, I was so hungry for the foods of home. I had to have the foods of home. So she'd go and she'd read about the Rare Fruit Growers Association. Could she get a brown sapote, a custard apple, which is like the cherimoya trees that grow in California? So she got them and she planted them from seeds. She got seeds from a neighbor. Can you imagine? The trees are taller than the house now. She had to hand pollinate them for years before they started getting pollinated themselves. This is her with her chickens. Her chickens roost in her cherimoya trees, and she has chicken tractors too. She lets the chickens roam through the garden. They eat the insects. Their poop, helps fertilize the gardens. Her neighbors, however, got very upset with her roosters and asked her to cut their throats. And she refused to cut their vocal cords, so she gave her roosters away. But she still has her chickens and fed me fresh eggs from the garden when I was there. Isn't this beautiful? This is a pitaya, very rare Asian fruit that she grows in her backyard. These are Ruhan's bananas. When I went back to do a reading at the Fullerton Arboretum in honor of her, her entire Punjabi family came in traditional clothing, and there were about 70 people there, and she fed me my breakfast with fresh bananas from the tree out back. I just want to point out the obvious once again. It's kind of a reiterated theme through all of this. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from being forced to move from your homeland. Ruhan left India because under Indira Gandhi she didn't have freedom of conscience. Indira Gandhi was pretty tyrannical in many ways. And so she fled. She had to come to America. She was not allowed to bring any more than $25 out of the country with her, even though she came from an extremely wealthy family in New Delhi that had a beautiful garden with peacocks roaming free through the roses. She came to America with $25. And so it was very important to her to feed herself. These gardens are very, very practical. They're not only symbolic, they not only have psychological value and spiritual value, they're very, very practical. Now we're going from this very exotic culture to a very homely tradition of the urban community garden. This is the second to the last story in my book. This chapter is called Community. And this is Alejandro Moreira. He was a Puerto Rican migrant worker for most of his life. He's the one who worked on the big industrial farms in the East, in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, harvesting flowers, harvesting fruit, harvesting vegetables. He would pick broccoli. He told me that sometimes he would unload, clean, and wash 100,000, the trains would come in with 100,000 bushels of broccoli a day, and all of the migrant farm workers would be standing there working on them. He showed me how he would work on his hands and knees cutting cucumbers, and when I asked him how long the rows were, he would point across town to the clock tower on a hill and say the rows stretched from here to there, and they would harvest them bent over or on hands and knees. The migrant farm workers never knew what chemicals, what pesticides or herbicides they were handling. And so a lot of these people in Holyoke, their bodies were scarred, their eyes, their hands, their health was ruined by the kind of labor they'd done. And it says something important about our food system, that the people who grow and harvest our food cannot afford to feed their own families. There's something fundamentally wrong with a food system that works that way. So a college student went down to this city, which was the first planned industrial city in America. It was predicated on cheap immigrant labor. And when the factories failed, there was no place for the Puerto Rican immigrants to go. They had all been brought here. They had been recruited by the farmers. And so they were stuck in this inner city, which was falling apart. More than half of this city is burnt out and boarded up. So a college student went down there and said, you guys know how to grow. How about if we start a community garden? They started one garden in 1991. Now they have a greenhouse. They have gardens in every neighborhood of this burnt-out city. They rent vacant lots, and people can have a 10 by 25-foot plot of organic soil. How did they get organic soil in the inner city? They went in and they cleaned it up. They got out the tires, the hypodermic needles, the glass, the plastic, the soda bottles, all the rubbish. They cleaned out these vacant lots. then they brought in soil, they brought in compost, they nursed the soil back to health, then they brought in a source of water. These are ají dulce seedlings. It means a sweet pepper. If any of you have ever eaten Puerto Rican cuisine, they have a sofrito that they make with this pepper. It's their salsa, their equivalent salsa. And so through the UMass Agricultural Extension Service, they were allowed to import these seeds. These had never been grown in the United States before about 10 years ago. It's 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 before about 10 years. So they brought them into this inner city, and they got grants, and they got enough money to build a greenhouse. The local glass company donated the glass. Volunteers built it. You can see through the window that mural on the wall. Oh, these are the seedlings close up. I'm backing up a moment. If you want an image of hope, this is my idea of a living image of hope. 5,000 ají dulce seedlings in this greenhouse that then the community gardeners, the Puerto Rican community gardeners, buy these seedlings, grow them in their community gardens, then they can harvest them and they can can them in their community licensed kitchen, and then they can sell them at the farmer's market. So what's happened is over a period of years from one community garden, they now have this sustainable system. And this is some of the gardens. This is cilantro being grown, and you can see the rotation of crops on a small scale. They start the seedlings, he'll thin them out. This is Edwin, and this is one of his beautiful community gardens. And this is the mature plant which he's going to harvest. And one of the things I love about this, the contrast between the setting and the garden is quite striking. The kind of dark crowding of the inner city and the beautiful serenity, the symmetry of these gardens. These community garden plots are marked out with string and little pieces of wood. It's a totally symbolic ordering of these plots. Nobody ever steals anything. Nobody trespasses on anybody's garden. It's just to mark one garden space from another and to give people this sense of pride and dignity and ownership. One of the other things I learned from all of these gardens is not only that beautiful symmetry and that joy in planting, that neat row of beans in that first image I showed you, but a sense of the love of beauty. You know, here is this man holding out to me this beautiful flower, this offering. I have a whole series of images of immigrants' hands working the earth. And this is their great achievement. They bought this building that had been rained into for 25 years. They got it for a steal. And then Tullio Inglesi, that Italian architect I introduced you to, he volunteered to do the drawings so they could renovate this building. They raised the money to renovate the building, and then a local artist designed this mural for them. The name of their organization is Nuestras Raíces, Our Roots. And there's their American flag, the images of the gardens. That's a flamboyant tree that's native to Puerto Rico. And it's this image of the way in which this fusion of cultures is all about life. I love the way those delicate roots embrace the globe and hold it. This is the fulfillment of their dream, the restaurant. So they have the seedlings growing in the greenhouse that goes into the community garden, that gets processed in the kitchen, it gets sold at the farmer's market, and the food also gets cooked and eaten here. Then the leftover food from here goes into the compost, and the compost goes back into the garden. It's a wonderful story of this inner city grassroots movement to revitalize a whole community, all on the basis of these little tiny gardens and their seeds. I think it's really an extraordinary image of hope. One of the questions audiences always ask me is, yes, these are wonderful stories about the first generation, but what about the children? Who's going to carry on these traditions? In this community, they now have gardens for boys, mentored by men, and for girls, mentored by women. This is Candido Nieves, who spent a whole day translating for me. We sat on a bench under a tree. This was the first garden. It's called La Finquita, meaning little farm. And after a whole day of him translating between the Spanish-speaking elders and me, at the end of the day I said, Candido, would you please show me your favorite part of the garden? So we're walking up the garden path, and he's very quiet, and I think, okay, he either didn't hear me or he's so shy that he doesn't want to do it. And then all of a sudden he stops here. And he cups his hand under this flower, and he said, see this flower? This is the pea flower. This flower is where the bean comes from. And then he said, and then he cupped his hand under that leaf, and he showed me the white markings on the leaf. He said, see the leaf? I love the way the white on the leaf mimics the color of the flower. And look at the design. Sometimes it looks like a kite. Sometimes it looks like an elephant. Sometimes it looks like a butterfly. And I'm standing there holding my breath thinking, I'm in a garden in the middle of a burnt-out inner city talking to a 13-year-old Puerto Rican boy whose imagination and heart have been kept alive and open and tender by the fact that he's worked in a garden since he was 6 years old. It defies all of our stereotypes, all of our racial stereotypes or our class stereotypes or our ideas of life in the inner city. And this is the power of a garden. It gives him this sense of being in nature, this intimacy. I asked Candido as we were walking back to the greenhouse and I had to leave, I said, Candido, what do you want to do when you finish school? And he said, I want to be a chef. I want to have my own restaurant, and I'm going to have an organic garden outside and grow all my own food that I'm going to serve in the restaurant. So this garden not only reaches back and gives him a sense of his past, his heritage in Puerto Rico, it gives him a future in America. It gives him a new way to think about his place in the world. Okay, this book comes full circle now, and this is the last story, and it's called Justice. This is sort of a breathless tour you're getting. This is Whit Davis. He's the 11th generation to farm this land. His original ancestor, Thomas Stanton, came in 1630 and walked from Virginia to Boston. And on the way, he was fed and guided by Native Americans who taught him their language. These were the Algonquian-speaking Indians of the eastern woodland tribes. By the time Thomas Stanton got to Boston, he was an extremely valuable person to the British because he could translate between the Indians and the English, who were fighting with the Dutch for hegemony in conquering New England. This is the corn the Indians fed him. This is white flint corn. This is a parching corn. It's not a corn you eat green. It's not a sweet corn. It's a flour corn, and it's an 8-row corn. This corn traveled east 1,000 years ago with the Indians who migrated east. It's been passed down through generations. This is a pure strain of sacred Native American corn. This is the corn that Roger Williams, who traveled with the Narragansett, wrote about. They would dry the corn for a year, parch it, and then pound it in a mortar and pestle. It was called yokig then, this very fine powder. The Indian warriors would carry it in little pouches on their belts, and they could travel for 200 miles just eating this yokig mixed with water. Or, if they ground it coarsely, then they would mix it with either beans or berries, and they would make it into these little cakes, which they would cook, otherwise known as, it's become what's known as a Johnny cake. Do you have Johnny cakes out here? You've heard of Johnny cakes? The original meaning was journey cakes. So, when the English defeated the Indians in the first war of extermination took place in Mystic, Connecticut in 1635, when the English surrounded a palisaded fort where 700 Pequot old men, women, and children were sleeping, all the warriors were gone, and they set fire to the fort, and in an hour they burned all of them alive. And after this defeat of the Pequots, they sold the Pequots into slavery and sold a few remaining warriors to the Mohegan tribe. And then they sold their land to the English. And so Thomas Stanton got thousands of acres of Pequot land, and when he got the land, he got the seeds of their corn. And he kept growing that corn and growing that corn and growing that corn. And now Whit, in the present, decided that in his old age, the thing he wants to do is to grow out this corn and to give it back to the tribes from which it was originally stolen. And this is Whit at the farmer's market making Johnny cakes for Yankees, because he grows everything else on his farm too. But at the heart of this whole idea is not just growing his corn, having his horses, having his chickens. He also harvests salt hay, which is sold. You can see all the different things he sells. The most important thing to him is this heritage that he's inherited. This house was built by Thomas Stanton. That glass in the background, this house goes back to 1740, and he's still living in it. Oh, I'm sorry. But I want to end with this. I thought I had this image of Whit with the corn again. When I met Whit, he had already started giving the corn back to the Pequots and the Mohegans. And when he heard that I was writing this book, I found out that Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was the last medicine woman of the Mohegan Indians, she had the last true Algonquian name in New England. She lived to be 105 years old. She just died about 2 years ago. And he knew her brother, and he knew her father. And he had this desire to honor her. Well, it turns out that Gladys Tantaquidget had visited with the Aquinnah tribe of Martha's Vineyard. They were the original owners of Martha's Vineyard, the Wampanoag tribe. And I found out that they had kept alive their corn tradition well into the 20th century. So I called the Aquinnah and I said, "Do you still have your corn?" And they said, "No." I said, "Would you like some?" And they were incredulous. I said, "I know where I can get it. I'll get you some." And so I went and I visited Witt, and I told them that the Aquinnah were moving back to their ancestral lands and trying to grow gardens again, but that they didn't have their seed corn. So the final gesture of this book is the day when Whit Davis goes through his bag of his very finest seed corn and hands these ears to me and says, "Here, bring these to the Aquinnah." And he told me how to tell them how to grow them again. So here again is this irony. The conquerors give the corn back to the conquered, right? And he says, "Tell them I wish them well. Tell them I wish them good luck in all of their endeavors." And he says to me, if something comes from somewhere, then it should come back to somewhere. And so in his old age, he's completing this whole cycle where my book began, with these displacements, the taking of land, the taking of seeds, the uprooting of cultures. There's this wonderful healing gesture of this 11th generation Yankee farmer giving the corn back to the Indians. And that's the note I'd like to end on. I have a few other images, but it's getting late. But I just want to say this one thing. You all know this if you grow corn. If you have 1 ear of corn, every kernel on that ear is a seed. If you plant every one of those kernels, you have more than enough corn to not only feed your family, but to feed your entire community, if every one of those kernels grows. And so the giving of 6 ears of corn to the Aquinnah is no small gift. It's giving back to them a sacred heritage that they no longer had. And so what I see is in this gesture is not only their past, their ancient corn restored, but their future. And the future is that seed and that future garden. And so on that note, I'd like to end and thank you for your great patience. Now, I hope you have questions and maybe stories. I know it's late, but maybe you do. And maybe you need a moment to think about it. Yes, anything at all. Any small questions? Yes.
What made you decide to write this book?
I tell that story in the prologue to the book, which is called Vanzetti's Garden. I grew up in an Italian ethnic family where food was very important and gardens were very important. And as the family sort of dissolved and fell apart, and as I moved on in my life, I lost touch with some of that heritage. And it was finding an image, a photograph at my father's funeral that linked my mother and her family to the Sacco Vanzetti case, the gravest miscarriage of justice against immigrants in the 20th century, that sort of ignited this desire in me to explore my immigrant heritage. And it was when I discovered that they consoled themselves while waiting to be executed for a crime they didn't commit. They consoled themselves for 8 years in prison by remembering gardens. The power of that garden to keep these men alive, to keep them hopeful, to affirm their sense of who they were. That's partly where this idea of the power of a garden came. Any other questions? Stories? Your own stories of ethnic heritage or gardens? If not, I don't want to keep you because it's been very long. Any other questions? Yes.
I noticed that in the pictures you shared, I saw no weeds at all.
Yes.
In these hand-tilled, hand-cultivated organic gardens. That's impressive.
Thank you for noticing that. They don't use any pesticides, don't use any fertilizer other than manure and compost. It's love. That Alejandro Morera, the first Puerto Rican I showed you, he's showing me how he soaks his beans overnight on that beet row. That was his third harvest of beans. And there were no weeds. He said he gets there as soon as the sun's up. Works there all day. Yes.
Having lived in Latin America and worked for 5 years in different countries, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, and founding a school of medical technology. in microbiology at the University of Quito, Ecuador. 2 or 3 years ago, one very brave woman was facing and realizing, we need even people here to begin to understand Spanish, but whether we are dealing with legal or illegal immigrants, they need to learn English. And as a self-starting, strong woman, she started this English speaking program at our Catholic church. And we had people from all different backgrounds actually came, not just Hispanic people, but we also had Korean women and Polish and other Eastern European people who wanted to have, what we were doing in a very informal but creative way of helping them with their English. Well, I had a Puerto Rican couple. And, in Ecuador, I worked with a Puerto Rican doctor of biochemistry, and, just an awesome woman who was working at Catholic University when I came, and, kind of guided me to work there in wonderful ways. And so I've never thought of Puerto Ricans as not being Americans. I've never thought of them as immigrating to the United States. They are United States citizens. And the wonderful thing was, when I worked with this older couple, the gentleman had learned to speak fluent English in the Army, and the mother learned to speak it later because she wanted some of her children who wanted advanced degrees and veterinary science, to come to the United States. And so it was actually easier, her English was better, it was easier to teach her. But, the concept when they were greeted in different places, because they were speaking Spanish, was, you're not American, are you? And you see, that's
Yeah.
why I can't think of them as immigrants.
Well,
They are.
it's actually true. One of the first people I met there said to me in Spanish through a translator, we're not immigrants. However, they are America's last colonial people. So there in the book it's ethnic Americans. But part of what I trace in the book is the injustice of their situation. They've been colonized for over 400 years. First by the Spanish, then by the United States. They cannot have a Puerto Rican passport. They cannot vote in presidential elections. They have very circumscribed rights. They can have a United States passport, and they are citizens. But there's this whole struggle in Puerto Rico now. Do they want full sovereignty and separation, or do they want full integration? So part of the reason they're here is because they are tracing that whole, they are an ethnic group, but they also are this sort of borderline threshold group, and they feel very strongly about it. Very, very strongly about it. And they're very proud of people. But the point is well taken, because they will say themselves, we're not immigrants, but they're treated like immigrants. They're definitely a minority.
I just wondered if these gardens contain herbs for healing at all?
Yes, they do. It's a great question. The Punjabi garden, Ruhan and Atma, the Falsa, they have all kinds of herbs that they use to treat. They grew turmeric, which is a natural anti-inflammatory. They have all of these healing herbs, and the neem tree is sort of a living medicine chest. It's a natural antibiotic. It's what Indians have been brushing their teeth with for years, keeping their teeth clean. So the Cambodians too have healing gardens, and a lot of them know. The Gullah elder Ralph, who was growing the indigo, his grandmother always treated all of them from her garden. They never went to the doctor. They never took medicine. She knew exactly what to harvest in the woods or to pick from her garden to help them through any illness. So,
Have you read the book? I think it's called Somebody Knows My Name.
sounds
I just finished it. It's a story. It's a novel about a woman who was captured as a slave before the revolution at age 11 in Africa, and it goes through her long life. But through that, I guess relearned about the loyalist African freed slaves who were shipped to Nova Scotia, and there
yes.
thereafter to Freetown, Sierra Leone.
And in fact, if you look at the planters' diaries, very often when planters were sick, they would go to their slaves for medicine.
But they
These
talk a
gardens.
lot about indigo production.
Yep. Oh, great. Thank you. These gardens are full of history. One of the things I realized is that you could tell the whole story of the settling of America through gardens. You could really, it's a whole different perspective on how to tell the story of history. Yes.
How did you find your interview subjects, and did you have, people that you interviewed that sort of ended up not being relevant to the project, or for one reason or another were sort of washouts? Or?
Yeah, well, it wasn't so much washouts as it was, I actually tried to include everybody. I did about 45 interviews, and my editor said, this can't be an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
You're going to lose your readers after about the first 10 or 20. So she forced me to pick. So the logic of the choice was, which stories reverberate most widely with the most groups of people? And the way I did it was I just told all of my friends that I was doing it. And I said, if any of you know anything about any ethnic gardeners, please tell me. And I made several interesting discoveries. First of all, whenever people would say, what are you writing about? And I'd say, immigrant or ethnic gardens, I'd say, oh, my grandmother had such a garden, or my grandfather. This spontaneous upwelling of stories, I could have collected thousands. So people sent me news clippings. Sometimes I bumped into people by accident. And then one of the stories I told this afternoon in the faculty seminars, when I found the Cambodians through a newspaper clipping, a friend of mine who teaches at Hampshire College in Amherst brought me from the Amherst newspaper. And at the end of the article was the name of the social worker who helped them get the land. So I called her. That's how I met Socaine. Socaine told me about the Puerto Rican gardeners and introduced me to Daniel Ross. And then when I was in Holyoke doing the story on the Puerto Rican gardeners, he said, oh, by the way, the man who donated the drawings for this building is this cute little Italian immigrant. He's about this tall. He looks like Santa Claus. He's really sweet. His name is Tullio, and so that's how I got to him. So I love that story in particular because that strikes me as a classic American story. And a Cambodian refugee would introduce me to a Puerto Rican inner city gardener who would introduce me to an Italian immigrant. So thank you for asking that. I found wit. How did I find wit? I found wit by getting lost. I got lost a lot. I was actually looking for Portuguese gardeners because in this part of New England, the northern Connecticut, Rhode Island area, there were a lot of Portuguese gardeners. They were famous for their terraced gardens, beautiful, beautiful gardens. And so I went up into Stonington. I was kayaking I was trying to meet my kayaking friends one day, and I was late at the launch, and they took off without me. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to drive around. And there was a plant sale, and I went into the plant sale, and I said to this local plant grower, I'm looking for some Portuguese gardeners. He said he had been apprenticed to one. And so he's describing, he said, it's going to be really hard to find. He said, you know, there's one elder down the road. If there are any Portuguese gardeners left, he'll know who they are. And then I said, well, I'm also looking for somebody who might know some Pequots and Mohegans. He said, he's the same guy, asked Wit, and he led me to Wit. So it was a very interesting process of finding people. I found people everywhere. I talked to a woman named Anna Peck in Ottumwa. I found her through a former Yale student of mine from Iowa, an Iowa farm girl. This woman was the first Latino woman in eastern Iowa. She came up from Cuba to Florida, and then she heard that they were looking for people to teach Spanish in the public schools in Iowa, so she came up here. She had no other Latino people to talk to. It was so lonely. She said she'd drive along, and if she saw a plant that looked like something from home, she'd ask her husband to stop the car so she could go out and talk to the plant. You know, and so she is now a liaison to the New York State community coming into that part of Iowa. So I heard these stories everywhere I went. I forgot to tell you a salient story about Gerard. This one little thing about the Polish immigrant who began to grow wine in Western Washington. He grows the only sustainable wine in Western Washington. Now, why did this Polish-American immigrant who grew up in New Jersey on a farm with his Polish grandfather and father, grew everything they ate? And like many immigrants, I grew up in this ethnic neighborhood. Do you remember ethnic neighborhoods? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. They'd all have grape arbors, and they'd have a picnic table set up under the grape arbor, and they'd make their own wine or their whiskey. So that's how Gerard grew up. And I said, well, how'd you end up in the Pacific Northwest, and how'd you end up growing wine? And he was stationed in Germany in the 60s, after the war. he noticed that the German countryside was really, really beautiful. And he volunteered at a German brewery. And what happened to him, his heart was broken in New Jersey when after the war, all the suburbs were being built. Farmland was disappearing. Acres and acres and acres of beautiful, beautiful farms were disappearing under tract housing. And he just couldn't stand it anymore. So here he is in Germany, surrounded by beautiful land, and he realizes the population density is greater than in New Jersey, but it's still beautiful. So he asked all these Germans in broken German, why is it still beautiful here? And the Germans would look at him like he was nuts, because he said to me, I should have hated Germany for what they did to my country, but I couldn't. It was too beautiful. So the Germans would look at him and say, well, why do you want to live where it's ugly? He said, well, in America, when people come, ugliness comes. So finally he gets a job, he volunteers at this brewery, and he says to Johann the brewer, he says, okay, how come it's so beautiful here? And Johann says, I can tell you, but you have to come home and have dinner. So he takes him home and he sets up a table on the back terrace. Because in this part of Germany, all of the homes are on the road and all of the arable fields are out behind the houses. And so Johann sets up this table and he sets the plates, fills them with food, and he says to Gerard, he points to the sausage, points over there, points to the sauerkraut, points over there, points to the wine, points over there, the bread over there, the radishes, the potatoes. And then he says, now do you understand? Gerard said, no, I'm sorry, I don't. So again, he said, okay, that sausage was raised on that farm, these potatoes come from that farm. Very meticulously points out where each thing on his plate came from. He said, now you understand? George said, I'm really sorry, I'm trying to get up. I don't. So finally Johann says, look, if you cannot see where your food comes from, you are doomed to live in ugliness. Isn't that a great phrase? I'll say it again. If you cannot see where your food comes from, you are doomed to live in ugliness. And that was the epiphany. And Gerard vowed after that he would live in beauty and he would learn how to grow something to support his family. Well, he went to the great wine regions and he learned that in Europe you can feed an entire family on 1 acre of land if you don't eat meat. If you eat meat, you need 5 acres. And so all these little vineyards, all these people making their own wine and having a beautiful life on the land. And he said that's what he's going to do. And that was the illuminating moment. That he wanted to live where he could see where his food came from and his wine came from. And that's his whole mission in life, to get people to eat from the land they live on. And if they eat together and love the food and love the land, then that will bind them back together in the community. He said he feels that's our best hope. That is our only hope for saving our land and for saving our food traditions and for healing what's wrong with America. Keep it small, keep it local, and share it with your neighbors. So thank you. We should have wine, don't you think? Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to meet you. Thanks for your patience with the technology.